Elden Ring. The project that generated a huge amount of hype since its reveal, highly rated for its world design and gameplay, and even won Game of the Year of 2022. As if the Game Awards had any merit. Yet, it displays so many flaws that should not have been present and should not be ignored. In fact, the game has such a large number of flaws that during my first and likely only playthrough, I found myself frequently questioning if the statement that Elden Ring was made using all the lessons learned from previous projects was actually true. Before I begin, I would like to make two things clear. Firstly, I tend to view video games by splitting them into two pieces: the gameplay and everything that surrounds it. In other words, whenever I play a game, I use one eye for audio and visual presentation, and the other eye specifically for game mechanics and systems. Metaphorically speaking, that is. Secondly, I am not one who plays games on release. I also do not mind being spoiled by reviews or story bits, as it is the experience itself that I seek. So it was that I decided to give Elden Ring a chance despite knowing that I wouldn't like it very much due to prior knowledge of its flaws through critiques made closer to the game's release. After giving it a much greater chance than I should have, partially because I paid for the whole game so I thought that I should at least finish it, I can say that some parts of the game offered more entertainment than I expected, while others were just as bad as I thought they were. Unfortunately, that was not an even split, as many of Elden Ring's flaws which were not present in From Software's previous games took precedence in my mind over a majority of my playthrough. This is not to say that I wasn't pleasantly surprised by other aspects which I will get to later, but it goes to show how in the minds of players, the good parts of a game can often be overshadowed by its flaws if enough of these flaws make themselves known. In other words, I do not believe it is possible to play through Elden Ring without coming across at least a few of them. If I had to grade Elden Ring on its artistic merit alone, that is, everything outside of gameplay, it would be an excellent example of visual design and world building, with only one big flaw. There are too many holes in the lore. When digging deeper, more questions are presented than answers, which is usually the opposite when looking into the lore of From Software's previous games. In terms of audio-visual presentation though, the game is quite spectacular, even with its somewhat dated graphics. I do not need to repeat the same old statement that the world looks gorgeous and that most of the music is great, do I? I hope not. As a video game, however, Elden Ring is about a 6 out of 10 for me. Going back to my previous expression of using one eye to view video games on their systems alone, I'd like to clarify that I tend to visualize games in the following manner. Through that eye alone, I would visualize the characters as grey models or sprites and the environment as basic geometric shapes. On top of that, I would disregard the story and audio-visual presentation and then see if the game is still enjoyable. In other words, to me, the presentation of a game is nothing more than a bonus. If it plays like shit, it is not a good game. Unfortunately, Elden Ring does not qualify as a good game as often as it should. It has all the tools required for a masterpiece. An open world, traditional Souls areas with good level design, a deliberate and satisfying combat system, great build variety, great enemy variety, and even a crafting system. But the way that From Software put them all together made it so that the game would never reach its true potential, and that the game would always turn out to be disappointing regardless of whether player expectations would be inflated or not, depending on the marketing. Let's begin with the core problem of Elden Ring. It seems that somewhere during development, Elden Ring was afflicted with a rather mysterious illness that prevents it from knowing when to stop and say that enough is enough. This illness has seeped into every part of the game, and it is made far worse because of it. I will split this video into two parts, the first being a wide look on different aspects of the game, and the second being a much closer look on the smaller aspects of gameplay, which are even more crucial. Regarding the open world, it is far too large for its own good. The intention of the developers when creating the open world, or at least those of director Hidetaka Miyazaki, is for players to feel like they are on an adventure, or so I've heard. There is nothing inherently wrong with the intention, but they clearly went way too far in this idea. The result is an open world that is so large that the developers struggle to fill it with meaningful content, and one which had many players finding it exhausting to traverse, especially towards the end of the game. In my case, the exhaustion came as early as Liurnia of the Lakes. The sheer scale of the open world was detrimental to the developers since there are only so many items and enemies that they can reasonably produce within the time frame of the game's development. They had a wide variety of things to place in the world, much greater than all previous games, But by the time all the assets were ready, they likely realized that the open world was so large that there was no choice but to reuse many enemies and bosses in order to populate the landscape. In other words, the lack of enemy variety is not the problem, it's the scale of the open world. This is also detrimental to player experience because traveling from place to place takes too much time and can be very tedious. Most of the landscape can be summarized as empty space with crafting materials and enemies scattered about. When it comes to open world games, there is often an expectation that they will have sizable amounts of side content outside of the main story, such as a myriad of collectible items or the presence of towns or NPCs to populate the landscape and provide quests. Elden Ring does not do this, and instead, the developers went for formulaic dungeons and field bosses. In fact, it was never the designer's intention to follow these trends, as the open world was supposed to be like the one in Shadow of the Colossus, where it was almost nothing but empty space. As such, other than dungeons and the occasional field boss, there is not much to do or find in the open world. Quote, "In using this format, Shadow managed to effectively break up the intense and bombastic Colossus battles with quiet periods of introspection and exploration. Much like Shadow of the Colossus, riding one's horse through an open, barren, and ominous world is sure to communicate the game's grim tone in a much fresher way than Dark Souls did." End quote. Keywords: introspection, barren, grim tone. This desire to communicate a tone which did not require an empty open world for players to understand, as evident from their previous games, has resulted in players having little to do when exploring the lands between. In my case, I often found myself actively hugging the side of mountains hoping to find a side dungeon, just so that I would have something to do. When presented with an open world, it is natural for players to expect a sizable amount of content within and not a barren landscape like the one featured in Shadow of the Colossus. From Software, in their desire to create something similar, created an open world that was empty in many places. This lack of content is especially true on repeat playthroughs, where just like the previous games, exploration and interaction with enemies are secondary to item collection and build setup. The amount of time between each step is also greatly lengthened in Elden Ring, which makes it even more time-consuming. This is made worse by the meager rewards given to players for clearing out groups of enemies in the open world, namely the lack of runes and upgrade materials. This provides yet another reason for players to avoid interacting with most of the content, and so most of the open world is reduced to boring empty stretches of land. This only gets worse in the DLC, as areas like the Graveside Plains, the Cerulean Coast, and Charles' Hidden Grave are woefully underutilized for how massive they are. Whatever rewards present in the open world are also completely useless most of the time, especially for materials, as even the first tier of smithing stones and rune items can be found littered all across the Land of Shadow. The first half of Bloodborne's and Dark Souls 3's DLCs, which could be accessed fairly early in the game due to their meager requirements, had upgrade materials which were mostly tuned for the mid-game to prevent players from having their option to overlevel their gear due to early access to endgame materials. While Elden Ring's DLC can be accessed as early as the others thanks to Vare's questline, the bosses that must be slain to gain access to it are intended to be late-game bosses, and players are expected to be at that level. It is baffling to me that the developers would provide upgrade materials that are worse in comparison, especially since they can be obtained in early regions with far less effort. Not to mention there are other ways for players to overlevel their character due to the game having an open world format, as well as the fact that most players would already have the ability to purchase an infinite amount of these materials. Since players would likely be at the late game anyway, providing more endgame materials including ancient dragon smithing stones would make it far more rewarding, as this would allow players to fully level up more weapons in line with their build. While we are on the topic of materials, let us move on to bell bearings. Elden Ring, like its predecessors, features items called bell bearings that, when given to the main merchant in the Round Table Hold, increases their item selection based on the items tied to the bell bearing. Since most of these items are very important, especially upgrade materials, it is safe to say that some bell bearings are essential. For some reason, From Software decided to have many essential upgrade materials placed in seemingly random side dungeons. So unless players know where to go to get these materials, their gear would be stuck at a specific level because they couldn't find the specific materials required to upgrade it to the next tier, even though they may possess the materials to upgrade it further. The same goes for bell bearings, which should have been placed in locations that are closer to legacy dungeons or even better inside them. This was also true for their older games, but the equivalent items were usually found in areas that were closer to the main progression path, so that players were more likely to get infinitely purchasable upgrade materials or consumables by the end of the game. At some point in development, From Software decided to add a crafting system, and with it they decided to have materials and cookbooks scattered all over the open world, as if to make it appear more content-rich than it actually was. In short, the crafting system is unnecessary and only serves to waste the player's time. These materials can often be harvested from flora and fauna found in the open world. Notable materials include mushrooms, herba, thin beast bones, ruin fragments, mushrooms, smoldering butterflies, cave moss, roa fruit, mushrooms, arteria leaves, altus bloom, and of course, mushrooms. The implementation of the crafting system leaves a lot to be desired. For instance, the only way to increase one's options are to find crafting manuals, or as the game calls them for some reason, cookbooks. There is absolutely no semblance of progression, no system that allows players to craft stronger items as their experience increases. This results in a laughably shallow system where players who want to engage with the system are forced to find cookbooks in random areas around the map. My biggest issue with the crafting system by far is that the only way to obtain crafting materials is to farm enemies and pick up items in the open world. Players are not able to infinitely buy many of the craftable items from merchants, and this includes a very important category of consumables. The ones that provide weapon buffs or damage resistances or remove status effects. These are essential for every player, especially when fighting bosses, and Elden Ring forces players to farm in order to craft these. Even basic fire bombs cannot be bought from merchants, so players who use them are forced to farm for them. And to make it worse, the enemies that use fire bombs do not drop the fire bombs, only the materials required to craft them, which adds an unnecessary layer of RNG to further annoy the player. The DLC does include bell bearings that cover items such as mushrooms and strings, but these are too well hidden and should have been in the base game. Unfortunately, those who do not own the DLC must still farm for these basic items, a decision I consider unacceptable. If there was one system that nobody would miss if it was removed from the game, it would likely be this one, because all it does is introduce more tedium at the cost of player engagement. If you have an answer as to why From Software thought it was acceptable to include both bell bearings and this sad excuse of a crafting system in the same game, do provide me with one, because I cannot think of any. Let us move on to the topic of side dungeons. It was a no-brainer to include them. They usually provide a decent combat challenge with rewards of varying quality, which is to be expected. Most of the dungeons are quite similar in terms of level design and enemy placement, which is unfortunate because players will likely get tired of them very quickly. However, some of them stand out due to having unique aesthetics or gimmicks, such as the jail cave in Caelid, the spirit caller's cave in the mountaintops, and even the giant conquering hero's grave, which is one of the best hero's graves in the game despite being quite obnoxious itself. This improves in the DLC with Belurat Jail and the numerous forges, not all of which have bosses. Unfortunately, due to the sheer scale of the open world, a large number of dungeons had to be placed, which meant that their variety would inevitably suffer due to time constraints. Additionally, item rewards had to be scattered about over a massive area. There was no other choice as there had to be something at the end of every dungeon. This resulted in players being rewarded with many items that do not fit their build, which results in many feeling that their time spent exploring had been wasted. An easy solution would be to simply reward players with extra upgrade materials on top of the item rewards, so that every player would be rewarded with something useful regardless of their build. The DLC improves upon side dungeons by making each one more unique in terms of layout and aesthetics. On top of that, I was surprised to find out that not all dungeons had bosses in them, which not only cuts down on repeated bosses shoved into side dungeons, but also makes the presence of a boss less predictable. Unfortunately, the higher quality and variety of each dungeon contributes to the emptiness of the DLC's open world, which was bereft of content even when compared to the base game. Regarding the side dungeons that are above ground, referred to as forts and castles, there are a lot fewer of them. Unfortunately, their quality is not above that of their underground counterparts. Castle Redmane and Fort Pharos are extremely short. Fort Laid is mostly empty, and Castle Sol and the Shaded Castle are filled with mostly reused enemies that are generally unenjoyable to fight. The DLC does not improve on this formula, as the Fog Rift Fort and the Fort of Reprimand are both unremarkable and full of enemies that can be found elsewhere. The decision to treat these night enemies as bosses was also quite unnecessary. However, there is one exception. Castle Morn, found in the Weeping Peninsula, is easily the best due to its unique aesthetics of enemies fighting one another. its story, which ties into 2 NPC questlines, as well as its boss that comes with a unique arena. It's a shame that only one is of such a high quality, but it's better than nothing, I suppose. Regarding field bosses, I believe that they were a great idea that was not executed as well as they probably should have been. On a first playthrough, most players would come across them by accident and would have to decide between fighting them then or returning later. The open world also features enemies and bosses that only appear at night. It benefits the game by providing the day-night cycle a purpose which justifies its inclusion. Due to the scale of the open world and the fact that all of them had to be optional, it was a reasonable decision to give them little to no story relevance, which would justify their recurring nature. I would prefer if there was at least one more enemy type in this category, but since they can be easily missed, it's somewhat justified since most players would not come across all of them on their first playthrough. Unfortunately for field bosses, the terrain is not always conducive for a boss fight, and some of them, most notably the wyverns, tend to get stuck on features such as large rocks. Whenever this happens, their rudimentary pathfinding tends to struggle when guiding the boss back to the player. Whenever the player accidentally exits the intended arena for the boss, it will lose interest and teleport all the way back to the center of the arena, breaking the flow and immersion of the entire fight. I noticed this the most with mobile bosses such as wyverns and the instance of Margit found in the capital outskirts. This could have easily been remedied with a single change. Whenever the player reaches the middle of an arena and stays there after the boss spawns, the game could wait a few seconds before spawning an impassable boundary similar to those found in Everjails. If the player chooses to exit the arena before the boundary forms, the boss could despawn until the player enters the arena again to prevent long-range cheese tactics. This would also prevent the aforementioned issues from occurring because the boss would not be able to exit the intended arena. Regarding recurring enemies and bosses, the developers had no choice but to copy and paste many of them as stated earlier. Unfortunately, many examples are quite difficult to justify. A rather well-known and obvious example takes the form of palette-swapped soldiers and knights that occupy the different regions. To the designer's credit, some effort was made to differentiate the members of the different factions, as most have special elemental attacks and ashes of war, or in the case of mausoleum soldiers, their ability to teleport. Regardless, these soldiers and knights are still too similar to one another, and their purpose as little more than palette swaps that exist to populate the landscape hurts the game in terms of enemy variety, and this is noticeable even as early as Liurnia. Another example is the multitude of reused bosses found in the open world. There are examples that are more justified as there are either fewer of them or they were reused in clever ways, such as Erdtree avatars, bell-bearing hunters, godskin apostles, and tree sentinels. The more egregious examples that were clearly reused for the sake of content include the Knights Cavalry, Wyverns, Crucible Knights, Misbegotten Warriors, Ulcerated Tree Spirits, Magma Worms, and Red Wolves of Radagon. The decision to reuse story bosses such as Godric, Moog, and Estelle was not a good one. Not only because the writers had to come up with some lore explanation to justify their presence, potentially creating more problems in that area, but also because players do not expect them to be reused unless the game clearly communicates that, for example, the subject in question acts as the player's rival throughout the story. Most bosses in Elden Ring die upon their defeat, so reusing them cheapens their actual fight and tends to leave a negative impression on players who do not expect to face them again, especially since they are named characters. Having so many recurring enemies and bosses also negatively affects player retention, especially towards the end of the game, where players may feel like there is nothing new to be seen. This may lead to players just running past dungeons or field bosses, especially when the rewards are unappealing. It also does not help that bosses found in earlier regions such as Limgrave are often much more diverse than the ones in later regions, as if the developers wanted to hide this issue from first-time players. That being said, the greater variety of bosses in earlier areas could very well be a deliberate choice to make a better first impression. As I've stated before, the developers of Elden Ring did not know when enough was enough, and the larger the open world got, the more the game suffers from inadequate enemy variety. As for the DLC, it was extremely disappointing to see that most of the field bosses were just reused from the base game. The Ghostflame Wyverns and Jagged Peak Drakes were given new attacks, but the Deathrite Bird, Tree Sentinels, and Ancient Dragon Senna Sacs were seemingly untouched. All of these, with the exception of the Tree Sentinels, are unenjoyable to fight, and their inclusion in a DLC that costs about 60% of the base game is extremely disappointing. Despite this, it is worth mentioning that most of the regular enemies in the DLC are unique, even though some were taken from base game templates such as Mesmer Soldiers and Black Knights. Unfortunately, they also had to be reused for multiple areas as the DLC's open world is also too large. Fortunately, there are enemies which I found to be surprisingly well designed and underutilized. Examples include Exiled Soldiers, Banished Knights, and Kaiden Sellswords. Because of how generic these enemies look as well as their backstory, one would likely expect them to be reused a lot more, but this is not the case for some reason. I would also like to touch on horseback enemies as this was also underutilized. In the early game, players meet Kaiden Sellswords, pallet-swapped mounted knights, and of course the Knights Cavalry, which look like they would be a significant enemy type throughout the game. However, the dynamic of an enemy that can fight both on horseback and on foot was not really seen anywhere else, not even in the Tree Sentinels. If the pallet-swapped soldiers could shoot from horseback, or if Tree Sentinels could dismount and fight on foot, it would offer more unique experiences, if only in a small way. The developers could also have used dismounted Tree Sentinels as recurring bosses, which would have likely reduced the number of ulcerated tree spirits in the game, and I doubt anyone would complain if that were to happen. Regarding the traditional Souls areas in Elden Ring referred to as Legacy Dungeons, From Software did a wonderful job with most of them in terms of layout. Every one of them has branching paths, multiple vertical levels, a fair number of shortcuts, secret areas, and even rooftop platforming sections. It is quite easy to get lost due to how complex some of them are, but I see this as a strength in terms of level design. Stormveil Castle, Volcano Manor, Farum Azula, and the royal capital of Leyndell are exceptional in terms of quality and stand out among the best that From Software has ever made. While Raya Lucaria and Miquella's Haligtree are also very well made, albeit they are a bit too short. In terms of enemy placement, however, the overall quality suffers a bit. Stormveil Castle and Leyndell mostly have enemies that provide a fair challenge, and whoever was in charge of enemy placement in these levels did a great job. However, the enemy placement can often be far from perfect, with large groups of annoying enemies in some areas and additional enemies found alongside bosses in others. Particularly egregious examples include the Bird Corridor in Farum Azula, the Misbegotten group at the end of Leyndell, and the large number of Oracle Envoys in the first part of the Haligtree. It would be reasonable for developers to give more consideration to earlier parts of a game, as this would provide a better first impression. I think this is why enemy placement and variety in later legacy dungeons tend to suffer more in comparison to the earlier locations. Due to there not being enough unique enemies left and likely time constraints as well, the developers probably had to rush some portions, which resulted in poor enemy placement in some areas. Regarding the large number of dual bosses in Elden Ring, it is obvious that the developers wanted to make many unique bosses but couldn't, so they had little choice but to reuse many bosses in ways that did not consist of a simple copy and paste. This resulted in many instances where there are two bosses instead of one. If more thought was put into which enemies were grouped together, we would have much more enjoyable dual fights. Unfortunately, we were stuck with terrible bosses such as the Crucible Knight duo found at the end of a terribly annoying dungeon, the Valiant Gargoyles in Nokron, the Crucible Knight and Misbegotten Warrior in Redmane Castle, the Tree Sentinel duo in Altus Plateau, and of course the Godskin duo in Farum Azula. The main issue here is that the bosses were not originally designed to take each other's movesets into account. So, many dual bosses ended up consisting of two aggressive melee-oriented bosses that gave players no room to breathe. It got so bad that From Software had to release a patch to force the bosses to take turns so that one of them would always be passive at any given time. Except the player is forced to play passively whenever the bosses are close to one another because both of them could attack at any time if the player decides to approach them. This happens very often because both bosses are still coded to walk towards the player constantly in a way where they are more likely to be closer together than separated. And in most instances, separating dual bosses are required to defeat them. I was lucky enough to only have to deal with this issue as I played the game after the patch, but my stance remains. As I noted while fighting the Crucible Knight duel, just because the experience has improved does not mean the dual bosses are now well designed. Because it was so much worse before, and From Software saw fit to release the game with the issue still present. As it stands now, almost every dual boss has issues that ensure that their ratings never go above below average. In fact, Elden Ring's dual bosses are made even worse because there are much better examples in their previous games. For those who may have forgotten, From Software is the same studio that designed Ornstein and Smough, Frida and Ariandel, and the Demon Prince, all of which are unique dual bosses with movesets that were designed with each other in mind. Anyway, back to Elden Ring. An easy solution would be to just make each dual boss a solo boss by removing one party. Since the bosses are reused anyway, I doubt players would complain if they now had to fight a single boss instead. If the developers couldn't make reused dual bosses work well, it would be better if they did not bother at all. Regarding enemy player type NPCs, Elden Ring has a fair number of them on top of invaders. Player type NPCs are exactly what they sound like, characters that use the same character model and animation set as the player. Focusing on enemies, it is good that almost all of them have unique equipment and spells, which makes most encounters somewhat different from each other. Unfortunately, most of them can be dealt with the same way, especially for players who can find a way to stunlock them to death. Furthermore, it is a well-known fact that stamina and mana pools only apply to players, which means that player-type NPCs can attack whenever they want and as many times as they want. This results in enemies such as Bloody Finger Okina and Violet Bloody Finger Eleonora that can be very obnoxious to fight. A shining example is even a unique boss near the end of the game, Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing. It is quite well known that From Software does not know how to properly balance player-type NPCs, so they tend to just give them highly inflated stats. The fact that they keep doing this in most of their games proves that they cannot make this kind of enemy work, yet they keep doing it. Well, at least the ones in Elden Ring aren't as horrendous as the ones in Bloodborne. Regarding NPC questlines, From Software has rarely ever designed them in an intuitive manner. In the previous games, questlines went from somewhat obfuscated to very easy to miss, and players who wished to experience all of them often had to rely on step-by-step guides from third-party sources. In Elden Ring, there are more questlines than ever before, and since the open world is so massive, it is more difficult than ever to find NPCs when they move around. They don't even make it clear where they go sometimes, so guides are basically necessary. When others talk about NPC questlines, especially in this game, the word outdated often comes to mind, mostly due to baffling design decisions. For example, players often have to reload areas, that is, leave the area or quit out of the game and return, just to progress to the next step of their questline, which often only consists of additional dialogue or the NPC moving to another location. Due to how these games read questline progression, NPCs do not move until the next time the player loads an area. In short, when the player makes progress, the game enables necessary flags that tell the NPC to move, but only in the background. Questline dialogue is also often written to suit the game's requirements, so NPCs tend to stand around without any sense of urgency, even if they may have their own scores to settle. This leads to comical situations where some NPCs would tell the player to go ahead on their own and that they would catch up later or something. In order to complete most questlines, players are required to quit out of the game and reload areas multiple times per questline because of how the game treats progression. Players are also forced to look up step-by-step guides from third-party sources because of the absence of any quest tracker in the game that could inform players of which questlines are available and where the corresponding NPCs are, especially when some steps are automatically skipped due to certain events, such as when players defeat Starscourge Radahn, and when questlines are made permanently unavailable, such as when Rykard is slain or when Miquella's spell is broken in the DLC. It is also worth mentioning that most questlines end with the corresponding NPC's death. Although death can be a fitting end to some stories, the frequent use of this trope makes most questlines extremely predictable. This often leads to players not completing their questlines due to the desire to preserve their lives. This can also lead to players who are used to questlines in previous games not investing themselves in these characters because they know that they're going to be dead anyway. All of this contributes to a lack of immersion, which leads to many players outright hating the way From Software treats NPC questlines. And here is the worst part. They could have improved on this in so many ways. Include an in-game quest tracker, Have NPCs instantly teleport to new locations or die and drop their items instead of forcing players to reload the area. Have more NPCs survive their journey, etc. But they chose not to. I do not need to make clear the fact that From Software's programmers and designers are professionals and that they can easily fix this in their next game. The unintuitive and obscure design of NPC questlines that is present in all their games so far must disappear in favor of something better. For now though, we are stuck with these. Especially egregious events include the following. 1. Seluvis's questline cannot be completed after giving Ranni the Finger Slayer blade, and the game gives no indication of this. 2. Yura moves to a pitch black location with no indication during his questline, but only if he helped the player deal with an invader earlier. 3. Alexander gets stuck near Jarberg with no indication that he would ever be there. 4. Korhin's questline requires the use of a spell with a rather high intelligence requirement, and reaching Farum Azula without advancing past that point locks players out of his questline and an alternate ending. 5. Count Ymir's questline forces players to waste time getting to 2 buttons at the end of 2 huge areas. The quest can also break as players who die to the invader once cannot access the next step unless specific actions are taken. 6. Millicent and Thiolier's questlines force players to reload many times just for new dialogue or item drops. 7. Thiolier's questline also requires players to drink St. Trina's nectar a total of 6 times, each resulting in death and wasted time with no indication of progress until the steps are completed. 8. Attacking any Kindred of Rot, which are enemies all throughout the base game, will anger Moore and risk his death. Moore does not tell the player that these enemies are his friends, only that he has friends. 9. Ansbach's questline requires players to find a special item and give it to him. But players must talk to Freya first, otherwise they will be locked out of her questline. To make it worse, Freya is found at the end of the area while Ansbach is found near the start. I hope you had a good laugh at how stupid this is. The questlines in the DLC are even more convoluted and confusing, which means that they are even easier to screw up than the ones in the base game. Let's move on. Since Elden Ring is an open-world game, one would reasonably expect the developers to implement some measures to inform players of an intended progression route. In all open-world games, players can and will wander into areas which they are not ready for. In this case, some developers opt to place indicators such as numbers or warning icons on top of enemies so that players who are underleveled immediately understand that they are not supposed to be there yet. According to director Miyazaki in an interview with PlayStation, quote, "So with elements like balancing the player's exploration alongside boss fights, the order of progression that players go through the game, and the progression of the events themselves throughout the map, trying to expand on player freedom while balancing all of this was a significant challenge, but we learned many great lessons attempting to achieve this. Another challenge making an open world game is the tempo and pacing of the player's progression." End quote. So, Miyazaki has acknowledged the challenges faced with progression and level scaling and adds that many lessons were learned. I do not believe every word of that simply because of how they chose to tackle this problem. In short, From Software does not even bother to address the issue of level scaling. Instead, they opted to guess where players would visit first and scale the enemies accordingly. Elden Ring is a game that allows players to go almost wherever they want from the beginning, and with such a vast open world, there is a very high chance of players wandering into late game locations too early. In my case, I went to the Dragon Barrow after Liurnia thinking the enemies within had scaling close to the ones in neighboring Caelid. For reference, the Dragon Barrow has enemies that are more difficult than both the mountaintops of the Giants and Farum Azula, while neighboring Caelid is just a bit more challenging than Liurnia. I did not allow that to stop me and beat 3 bosses leading to Gurranq. But that should not be excused, as I was able to make it there because of my stubbornness, not because the level scaling of the area was reasonable. In choosing to scale enemies based on where they thought players would go without any measures to guide them away from overly difficult areas besides death, From Software had irreversibly harmed many players' experiences, including mine. To make it worse, this should not have even happened because they had good examples to learn from. A normal progression route would be comparatively straightforward. Perhaps one would be recommended to explore nearby areas first, and most neighboring regions would be more in line with each other with occasional outliers. For Elden Ring, this is the game progression route found on Vextra Life. If I were to draw an arrow from the smallest number to the largest, it would look absolutely nonsensical, even though it is relatively close to From Software's wild guesses. This is not improved in the DLC at all. The game guides players towards the Shadow Keep early on, but it is one of the most difficult areas in terms of progression, not to mention that going to Shadow Keep will break many NPC questlines. Not knowing this, I went straight there after Castle Ensis after completing those questlines, killed Mesmer, and then cleared about 10 areas that are not only supposedly easier than Shadow Keep, but are also only accessible from Shadow Keep in some cases. If I were to draw an arrow from the smallest number to the largest, it would look just as stupid. Again, it is baffling to me how anyone thought that this was acceptable in the slightest. For shame. Since we are on the topic of level scaling, I would like to bring up DLC exclusive Scadutree Blessings. They are there to boost the player's offensive and defensive capabilities by a rather large percentage so that they can stand a chance against enemies in the DLC. These benefits only function in the DLC so as to avoid players abusing it to steamroll everything in the base game. To level up one's blessings, one must collect Scadutree fragments, many of which are found in the open world, though there are a few found within mandatory legacy dungeons. Mechanically, it functions like golden seeds from the base game, as in the more blessings one has, the more Scadutree fragments it takes to level it up further. The main intention of the developers was to use the Scadutree blessing system to encourage exploration. If players struggle due to the lack of blessings, they are directed to explore the open world to collect these key items and return later, not dissimilar to Market or the Tree Sentinel in Limgrave. I understand why the developers wanted the new system to re-encourage exploration, and I understand why many players make fun of others for not using these fragments. I do not agree with either. These Scadutree fragments, as mentioned earlier, allow players to stand a chance against enemies in the DLC. In other words, and I must make this clear, they are not there to make the DLC easy. They are there to make the DLC reasonable in terms of difficulty. It is reasonable to expect that most players would find at least a few of these fragments before even attempting the main bosses. It is not reasonable to expect players to level up their blessings to the maximum level, especially due to the open world issues I have stated earlier. It is also not reasonable to expect players to go around collecting these fragments on repeat playthroughs. In this case, the process of item collection is lengthened due to the system being in place, not to mention the amount of time players have to dedicate to this new chore before they can even engage with legacy dungeons and bosses. Most importantly, their intention to re-encourage exploration, which was the primary motivation behind this system, backfires due to one reason. The desire to explore is intrinsic. For those who already wish to explore, the Scadutree blessing system is unnecessary as it does not instill a new desire for exploration. For those who are only interested in the main story content, this system needlessly punishes them for heading in the direction the game tells them to go and decreases their engagement with the game because it forces them to look for additional items, often with a guide because it just saves time. So I have made it quite clear that this system is unnecessary. Well, I will make another thing clear. It was only made necessary because of another problem with Elden Ring. Now, I have come across some undesirables who laugh at others for allegedly beating the base game with an overpowered build and complaining that they cannot do the same in the DLC. These are the same people that mindlessly throw the phrase "get good" like artillery shells in the Great War. This display of toxicity sows division and makes the already elitist community even more unwelcoming, but that is a topic for another video. Regardless, it is relevant. From Software's decision to add this system was only necessary due to their failure to balance their own game. Many enemies in the DLC were given way too much health and hyper armor frames with the expectation that players would catch up to them by leveling up their blessings. This made it so that players could not instantly steamroll everything in the DLC even if they could do it in the base game. In other words, the player's build and levels do not matter, as when entering the DLC they would have to start at level 1 again. Not only does this invoke a feeling of non-progression, this also takes away options that were once viable. Most players do not like it when their options are taken away. This is why developers have to be very careful when nerfing weapons or strategies in any game. Players, when given the chance, will optimize the fun out of a game, and it is the developer's job to prevent that from happening. From Software, through their decision to give players such a huge amount of freedom in both the base game and the DLC, has made a game that allows overpowered builds and playstyles to exist, be it one-shot spells, bleed and frost builds, or jump attack spam. As a response to their own failure to control the player's power level, From Software implemented the Scadutree Blessing system, which has taken away many options for many players. So, to fix their mistake, they added a system solely to take away that power, only to slowly give it back through artificial progression. They have made DLCs that did not use this system before. Every single DLC in the previous games were scaled for the endgame, and level scaling ramped up slowly from there. The player's build matters, so the feeling of non-progression was absent. The enemies did not need inflated stats, as players could not become as powerful as they can in Elden Ring, so any system like the Scadutree Blessings was not required. To summarize, the Scadutree Blessing system is a non-solution to a problem that plagues the base game and only acts as an obstacle to progression in the DLC, especially on repeat playthroughs. To put it mildly, I absolutely hate it. Ever since Demon's Souls, the multiplayer component of From Software's games have been a playground for the developers. Many unique and innovative ideas such as messages, vagrants, covenants, and the drop-in drop-out system for more direct interactions have come and gone over the years. Dark Souls had the most interesting ways for indirect interactions between players by far. The most unique being the Gravelord Covenant, which allowed players to introduce additional enemies into another player's game, and rare drift items and vagrants that can spawn if enough items or humanity are dropped by other players. Unfortunately, some of these, including the two I've just mentioned, have not returned since, and unfortunately for Elden Ring, a few multiplayer features that were present for multiple games were removed. The most notable feature that was almost universally criticized, or so I'm led to believe, is the presence of covenants. Most of the Souls games allowed players to align themselves with different NPCs belonging to different factions and undertake specific tasks to obtain special rewards. For example, players could focus entirely on co-op with the Warriors of Sunlight, invade innocent players to protect certain areas with the Watchdogs of Farron or the Bellkeepers, invade invaders as a blue spirit under the Blades of the Dark Moon, or become a Gravelord, which introduces more enemies into other players' games, but also allows them to invade and kill them in order to get rid of those enemies. So, it would be safe to assume, and many did, that Elden Ring would add even more covenants since it is the largest game that From Software has ever made. But that is what a normal studio would do, and From Software is not that. In order to allegedly make multiplayer more accessible, the designers chose to remove covenants entirely, despite the fact that Elden Ring has the highest number of characters and bosses that speak to the player. For example, Godric demands the player to kneel, and Morgoth only seeks to prevent the player from becoming Elden Lord. Even Ranni, who isn't a boss, has her own group of followers. So why are players not presented with the option to formally align themselves with these characters? For instance, one could kneel to Godric and invade low-level opponents to get their limbs so that they wouldn't be grafted themselves, or side with Morgoth and defend Leyndell by invading other players in the Legacy Dungeon. Perhaps if the host summons one person for help, there would be up to 2 invaders. The Gravelord Covenant could have returns through Godwyn, as players could spread death throughout the land or find a way to give him a true death, futile as it may be. As for a co-op covenant, it would make sense for Alexander to provide the player with access, allowing them to work together with other players to grow stronger like Alexander did during his questline. Unfortunately, these remain as nothing more than what-if scenarios, where players would have the option to actually side with these characters. In addition, Elden Ring is still not built for multiplayer interactions, just like the previous games. As far as I'm aware, the connection between players is still peer-to-peer, which is the worst way they could have handled it. As one who used to play Dark Souls 3 PvP, I have encountered countless instances of phantom range, bugged enemies, backstab desyncs, disconnects in the middle of combat, being unable to connect when summoned, lagging players who slide around and cannot be harmed, and undesirables who abuse tech like hard swapping and bugs like item duplication and Estes animation cancelling. Come to think of it, I was lucky to only encounter those. It seems that From Software has never moved on from their terrible implementation of direct interactions, especially when it comes to the netcode. Peer-to-peer connections have been in their games since Demon's Souls, and even then it was a thing of the past. Of course, with the level of freedom given to players, overpowered builds were an inevitability. I heard that PvP during the early days was mostly weapon art spam and that there were many fixes to items specifically for PvP, but I do not care enough to go into the specifics. As for the nerfs, they are a non-solution, just like Scattertree Blessings. Those who wish to engage in PvP have to spend quite a number of items such as elemental weapon buffs, but the tedious crafting system encourages many of them to use cheats in order to get those items. Those who want to engage in co-op in open world areas are unable to use the horse, which makes it extremely tedious to get around. Those who want to engage in long uninterrupted sessions of co-op are not able to do so as the developers put barriers in place to prevent players from traveling between regions while multiplayer is enabled. Those who want to engage in either co-op or PvP with a larger group of players are not allowed to do so as the player count was reduced back to 4. For reference, Dark Souls 3 allowed for up to 6 players in a single instance. So, not only are there fewer incentives to engage in co-op and PvP than ever before, those who want to engage have to make sacrifices or rely on mods such as the ever-popular seamless co-op, which director Miyazaki has even acknowledged. It would be common sense to assume that in an open world game that presents multiplayer as a feature, players who wish to play together would expect to be able to engage in long sessions on horseback without disruptions due to network issues or developer-placed barriers. It is baffling to me that the professional developers at From Software had not even considered this possibility. All of this is why I refuse to engage with co-op or PvP in Elden Ring unless I have a vested interest in doing so, such as playing with a streamer that I look up to. Were it not for this one scenario, I would have uninstalled the game right after I finished it. One of Elden Ring's most controversial topics is the presence of Spirit Ashes. Some say that using Spirit Ashes is not the right way to play the game, while others say that since they are put in the game to be used, it is fair game. After all, Miyazaki himself cannot beat the game without them, so it wouldn't be a problem for regular players to use them. For a long time, I used to think that going solo with a melee weapon was the only correct way to play these games, but then I grew up. Now, my stance is far less rigid. The game allows players to use things like summons, overpowered weapons, and spirit ashes, so I argue that it's perfectly fine for players to use them, or at least try them out. In fact, there should be no shame in using them, especially for problematic cases such as the Valiant Gargoyles or the Godskin duo. The only bosses where I used Spirit Ashes without first attempting them solo were the Valiant Gargoyles and many of the reused bosses that I was tired of fighting, which offered a good opportunity to test the power of my Spirit Ashes. My only real issue with Spirit Ashes is that, as far as I'm aware, enemies and bosses do not increase in scaling when they are summoned, which isn't the case for player or NPC summons. This means that there is less incentive to summon for co-op, or use NPC summons, which had always performed rather poorly in these games. This, coupled with the fact that most enemies cannot effectively deal with multiple opponents, means that Spirit Ashes would end up as one of the most attractive options for struggling players. I only wish most of the weaker Spirit Ashes were buffed so that most of them would not become almost useless towards the end of the game. Regarding Ashes of War, they were mostly a great improvement from their original iterations in Dark Souls 3. For simplicity, I will refer to the collectible items as Ashes of War and the actual abilities as weapon arts. There are two major ways that Elden Ring improved upon the concept. Firstly, many weapon arts in Elden Ring are quite powerful on their own, which means that more of them are now viable all throughout the game. This decision was probably made in response to their general lack of viability in Dark Souls 3, though it risks the possibility of players relying solely on weapon arts to carry them through the game. Secondly, players are now allowed to change the weapon art of most regular weapons at sites of grace, and alter the damage scaling of the weapon as they see fit. This allows for a huge number of possible outcomes, which is great for player choice but risks the possibility of players abusing certain combinations. Of course, like Dark Souls 3, special weapons with unique weapon arts cannot be changed. These usually come with boss weapons, and although they're supposed to be strong, the developers overtuned some of them, resulting in overpowered weapon arts such as Taker's Flames and Ancient Dragon Lightning Spear. On the other hand, some weapon arts generally lack viability, especially towards the late game. For example, Stormcaller, Angel's Wings, Double Slash, and Palm Blast are too slow to safely cast, while others like Sky Shot, Stamp, Sweep, Repeating Thrust, Spinning Chain, Ground Slam, and Blade of Gold are rendered obsolete by similar alternatives. Nevertheless, it was a good decision to have many weapon arts available for several weapon classes, and have many Ashes of War accessible at the beginning of the game through Night Bernal. Unfortunately, the DLC does not improve upon this, as several weapon classes such as Backhand Blades, Dryleaf Arts, and Light Great Swords only have one weapon each that allows players to change their weapon art, which there are very few of and cannot be applied to other weapon classes, which greatly limits player choice in stark contrast to the base game. Furthermore, in order to provide players with these options, the developers chose to copy and paste some base game weapons, such as the Troll Knight's Sword and Butchering Knife, instead of changing the older versions to allow the incorporation of new weapon arts. This resulted in identical looking weapons that are only differentiated by their weapon arts, which is not a good look for a DLC that costs roughly 60% of the base game. It would be safe to say that when a fight takes place, be it in fiction or in real life, the parties involved usually know why they are fighting before the fight begins. For boss fights in the Souls games, however, most of the lore is kept hidden until after the fight, where the only way to find out the story of the boss is through reading item descriptions. In video games, player impressions of boss fights are usually improved if they are motivated through the use of build-up, which can be delivered through methods including but not limited to environmental details, cutscenes, or NPC dialogue. The result can be players being motivated to finally defeat a rival at the end of a story or putting a once powerful hero out of their misery. For bosses without build-up, most players who play blind are motivated to defeat a boss only for the sake of doing so, leading to the absence of emotional weight during the fight regardless of how well their backstory is written. This is not a good way to tell a story from the player character's perspective, simply because it is usually better for players to find out why they must defeat a boss before the fight takes place instead of only after the boss has been defeated. Not every boss requires build-up, especially not the ones found in side dungeons or hidden locations. It would be more reasonable for the developers to give it only to story-relevant bosses, as their fights may build up towards the final boss. Some examples of bosses with good build-up include Knight Artorias, Gwyn Lord of Cinder, the Burnt Ivory King, the Twin Princess, Slave Knight Gale, Lady Maria, and Genichiro Ashina. Some examples of bosses with poor or insufficient build-up include Great Grey Wolf Sif, Ornstein and Smough, Ceaseless Discharge, Sir Alon, the Abyss Watchers, the Nameless King, and the Soul of Cinder. To From Software's credit, they have increased the number of bosses with good build-up in Elden Ring, especially for the main story bosses. The game is full of NPC dialogue and environmental details that are presented to the player shortly before the fight takes place. Godric the Golden, or as the game calls him mockingly, the Grafted, has a great amount of build-up present all the way to his encounter, which motivates players to bring down the depraved descendants of the Golden lineage. Starscourge Radahn is also a good example, namely due to the inclusion of a unique cutscene and the whole festival that clearly communicates to players that they are there to put Radahn out of his misery. However, Elden Ring also has a few characters who could have used more build-up, such as Rennala, Godfrey, and Malekith. As for the DLC, NPCs constantly talk about Miquella, constantly reminding players of their inevitable showdown. Bale the Dread also has some build-up through NPC dialogue with the Dragon Communion Priestess and aesthetics of the Jagged Peak. However, bosses such as the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, Rallana, and Romina could have used a lot more build-up. The only reason players must defeat Romina, for example, is that she is in the way of the player's main goal, to reach the end of the DLC and kill Miquella. This is not a very good look. Overall, Elden Ring does improve upon the use of build-up, but not to the degree that I would consider satisfactory, mainly because it was quite rare in From Software's older games to begin with. Still, credit should be given where it is due. Now, this video is mostly focused on gameplay as evident from the chosen topics so far. However, some aesthetic grievances have to be made clear as well. For example, Elden Ring's open world is not believable at all. From Software expects their players to believe that they are traveling across a massive landscape with kingdoms, villages, and settlements, but anybody who is capable of thinking and breathing at the same time will question the lack of infrastructure to support such civilizations. Maybe this wouldn't come to mind immediately, but it would surely be noticed subconsciously. Every castle, city, and village that is present in the game does not have any infrastructure to support itself. There are no factories, shops, forges, or even farms to speak of, not even in the windmill village in Altus Plateau. Every mine in the game is just a cave, without any roads that lead to it or even buildings outside to store materials. Every copy-pasted shack in the game is bare bones and does not protect one from the elements, and so has no reason to be there. Their inclusion is obvious. The developers just needed to fill an area with some content and chose to put a shack there. Some more egregious examples include the town of Celia and the shaman village in the DLC, which literally consists of a few small houses and nothing else. Obviously, this is immersion breaking, even more so if one notices it immediately or if someone else points it out to them. It is laughable that From Software thought that players could be immersed in something so unbelievable, especially when far better examples have been created by other studios years beforehand. No effort is made here, and it is a damn shame that the developers stuck with it. I briefly mentioned in the intro that Elden Ring has too many plot holes and that digging deeper into the lore only presents more questions. For example, the game keeps reminding players that the main goal is to become the next Elden Lord, but players are not told of the responsibilities or influence that comes with the title. It is unclear if an Elden Lord gets any say in matters concerning the lands between, as they may just be enforcers like Godfrey was to Marika when they established the Golden Order. It is also unclear if the title grants actual power like the monarchs of times past, or if it is ceremonial like the monarchs of today. So why would the Tarnished want to become the next Elden Lord without knowing what the title grants them? It should be obvious that having players work towards a goal without a clear incentive is not a good idea. Here are a few extra examples. 1. How much time had passed between Marika shattering the Elden Ring and the war known as the Shattering. 2. How Radagon and Marika can exist at the same time and act on their own. 3. How Evergails work. 4. How Farum Azula is able to exist outside of time. 5. How Gurranq is able to exist even after Maliketh is defeated. 6. How Godwyn's corpse was able to grow so large. 7. Why Ranni specifically has her own 2 fingers. 8. Why there are 2 fingers specifically at the top of the Divine Towers. 9. Why and how Ichi was killed with black flame while surrounded by black knife corpses. 10. How Marika was able to basically turn the Land of Shadow into its own dimension. 11. Whether the butchering of Marika's people was before or after she betrayed the Hornsent. Or why promised consort Radahn looks nothing like Mohg despite inhabiting Mohg's body. These are only a few examples, and having missing information all throughout the game's lore only makes things even more difficult to understand. I know that Miyazaki wants players to form their own theories and interpretations of events, but theory crafting can only happen when there is enough information to form the base of said theory. If the writers decided to leave a story bit with no information, then there is nothing to uncover. By choosing to leave so many plot points without explanation, they risk players losing interest in their world the more they choose to investigate the lore. I for one no longer take Elden Ring's lore seriously. Regarding original ideas, Elden Ring does have a few of its own. Godric and Morgott come to mind as great examples of pitiful and tragic bosses. Estelle is an interesting design for an otherworldly boss, and in terms of boss fights, Starscourge Radahn is unique and memorable for having a ranged section at the beginning of his fight on top of being comparable to an MMO raid boss. Unfortunately, Elden Ring has so many callbacks and reused ideas from previous games that even early in my playthrough I had this impression that the developers had long ran out of original ideas and concepts for this game, which is not a good look since Elden Ring is a new IP. 1. Erdtree avatars are just asylum demons from Dark Souls with Prince Lothric's projectile attack. 2. All the Wyvern field bosses have multiple attacks taken from Dark Aether Midir. 3. The Fell Twins are just the worst version of the Four Kings from Dark Souls. 4. The Red Wolf of Radagon is basically Great Grey Wolf Sith with magic. 5. The Godskin duo is an obvious visual callback to Ornstein and Smough. 6. The Spirit Crawler Snail concept is taken from the Witches of Hemwick from Bloodborne. 7. The Flame Altars at Seofa River and Nokron are callbacks to Farron Keep. They even use the same mechanics, and to make it worse, 8 flames have to be lit to fight the two very similar bosses found here. 8. The fact that some magma worms walk on 2 legs in their second phase should be immediately recognizable to those who are familiar with Bloodborne. 9. Malekith and Blythe are just more references to Guts from Berserk, which already got old thanks to Slave Knight Gale and Knight Artorias. 10. Elden Ring has ancient dragons with stone scales that were rulers of a past era, which was straight up copied from Dark Souls. 11. The Golden Order had a war against the race of giants which resulted in the near extinction of these giants. The same events happened in Dark Souls 2. 12. The Valiant Gargoyles are just Dark Souls spell gargoyles, without any of the mechanics that made the original fair and balanced. 13. The Godskin Nobles arena in Volcano Manor is just a smaller version of Pontiff Sullivan's arena, this time with even more obstacles. 14. Draining the water in the DLC's Shadowkeep is just a boring rehash of the main gimmick of New Londo. 15. Morgott using his accursed blood in his second phase is just Lady Maria, again. 16. Sir Gideon Ofnir uses an annoying spell called Triple Rings of Light, which was taken from Slave Knight Gale. 17. The Elden Beast is basically Elden Ring's version of the Moon Presence, but this one is not a secret boss for some reason. 18. The Draconic Tree Sentinel and Lanedale Knights have an attack that calls down a lightning bolt on the player's position, taken straight from the Nameless King. 19. Dragon Lord Placidus Sax has a huge laser attack that was taken from Dark Aether Midir. He also has a string of teleporting melee attacks that were inspired by Prince Lorien. 20. Rallana, not to be confused with Rennala, is an obvious visual clone of Pontiff Sullivan in her second phase. 21. Rennala, not to be confused with Rallana, has a laser attack called Comet Azure. It is also called Soul Stream, used by the Soul of Cinder. Her first phase is a callback to the Deacons of the Deep, while her second phase is reminiscent of Elena the Squalid Queen. 22. Radahn, not to be confused with Radahn, has an arrow rain attack that was taken straight from Aldrich, Devourer of Gods, specifically the phase 2 version of the attack that follows the player around. 23. In his second phase, Radahn, not to be confused with Radahn, is an obvious visual callback to the Twin Princes. He also has a combo which was taken straight from Pontiff Sullivan. 24. Story-wise, Rykard, Lord of Blasphemy, is basically another version of Aldrich, Devourer of Gods. Gameplay-wise, he's a combination of the Divine Dragon and Yorm the Giant, but without the NPC questline that made the latter special. Now, I do not mind references of others' works or callbacks to previous titles as long as they are somewhat original, such as the Abyss Watchers being a unique boss fight despite being a callback to Artorias, or the Divine Beast Dancing Lion having interesting mechanics despite the concept of element switching already being present in the Soul of Cinder. However, if the callback cannot stand on its own without the original, then it should not be treated as anything more than a lazy copy-paste. As for company mascots such as Patches or the Moonlight Greatsword, exceptions should be made for obvious reasons. But we are not done yet. The stagnation concept, which is apparently well known in Japan, was originally implemented into Dark Souls, and funnily enough, they have not moved from it ever since. In short, stagnant water when left untouched can be a breeding ground for bacteria and lead to spread of disease, while flowing water is said to cleanse the soul on top of preventing said diseases from taking root. But stagnation as a concept is much more than that. In these games, a land without change stagnates over time, leading to several detrimental effects. In Dark Souls, it was the undead, then the unkindled. In Bloodborne, it was the vile bloods and vermin. In Sekiro, it was the rejuvenating waters, stagnated blood from the dragon's heritage that leads to dragon rot, as well as centipedes and corruption that comes with immortality. In Elden Ring, it is the eternal cycle of rebirth carried out by the Earth Tree and the limbo state of Godwyn's soulless corpse that led to the spread of the undead. In every one of these games, the world is depicted to be in decay and civilizations tend to be well past their prime. In every one of these games, the good ending tends to be the one where the player character introduces change to the land. It's quite funny that even though From Software has made this message abundantly clear, they stubbornly refuse to move on from it. They even went on to insert so many callbacks to their previous games as if they didn't want to move on, despite the obvious message of Dark Souls 3, that being they didn't want to be stuck making Dark Souls games. Since we are on the theme of stagnation, allow me to move on to the stagnation of From Software's Dark Souls gameplay formula. Regarding the Dark Souls gameplay formula, it is obvious that the formula has stagnated since Demon's Souls. This is much easier to notice for those who have finished any previous From Software games. For instance, 1. Most weapon types typically only have 1 or 2 movesets, and most weapons of the same type are similar at best and interchangeable at worst. This makes many weapons irrelevant as there are better alternatives, either in terms of speed, damage, or utility. Bloodborne's trick weapons offer a significant improvement as they ditched quantity for quality and variety, but they have not returned since. It's disappointing to see that From Software chose to revert to this quantity over quality mindset in this regard. 2. Ranged combat and spellcasting in From Software's games have always been poorly implemented. The developers' desire and attempts to make these games more and more action-focused is understandable and commendable, but the disparity between the player's options when it comes to melee and ranged combat is far too large. Bows have always been weak in these games due to their low damage, limited moveset, and limited ammunition, and great bows are too slow to be viable in boss fights. Players are also limited to 2 types of ammunition at any given time, which greatly limits flexibility. At this point, regular bows are just used for status builds, which are far too specific to be generally viable. Spellcasting is far more egregious. While the memory slot system is alright, having more than 2 spells equipped is highly impractical. This is because players are forced to switch between spells in combat in a manner identical to that of consumables. This unintuitive system forces players to look away from the target in the middle of the screen, which leads to brief moments of hesitation as they check if the desired spell is currently selected. In every Souls game, hesitation often leads to death, especially against mobile and aggressive enemies. Spellcasting is also often limited to pressing one button repeatedly. In melee combat, players can access light and heavy attacks, dodge attacks, jump attacks, and weapon arts with different inputs for each. When using bows, players can access 2 types of arrows and weapon arts on top of dodge and sprint attacks. On the other hand, spellcasters cannot even bind different inputs to different spells, which is in direct contrast to the expectation that different inputs allow the character to perform different actions. What if instead of memory slots, we had 5 slots that were labeled light, heavy, dodge, jump, and sprint attacks? Then, for example, players could have melee spells bound to sprint attacks or projectiles bound to heavy attacks. This would avoid the unintuitive consumable style spell selection and thus hesitation in battle. This would also encourage players to use a greater variety of spells, as there would be no reason not to use every one of these bindings. But alas, we are stuck with From Software's terrible spellcasting system, which has not evolved since Demon's Souls. 3. One of Elden Ring's greatest strengths is build variety, but certain builds are heavily disincentivized towards the late game. Players who use these builds without prior knowledge get unnecessarily punished for using builds that the developers presented as viable in the early game. For example, blocking attacks and guard counters become less and less viable in the late game. Everything just comes down to dodging attacks again, which means that the new guard counter system is heavily disincentivized. Holy builds were also presented as viable in the early game, but become essentially useless in the late game due to most enemies having large health pools and high holy damage resistance. While players using guard counters could adapt their playstyle to counter the lack of viability, those relying on holy damage have little choice but to change their build or damage type entirely. Not only that, but many enemies in the DLC are suddenly weak to holy damage again, which is very jarring to say the least. 4. When it comes to the player's movement and offensive abilities, the lack of innovation besides the long overdue ability to jump heavily limits the developer's freedom to innovate when it comes to enemy movesets. In these games, enemy movesets are usually limited based on the player's abilities, with a long-standing expectation that players can avoid all damage with enough practice and experience. The stagnation of the player's abilities, most notably their movement and attack speeds, forces the developers to design enemies that attack just slow enough for the player to dodge all of them, and move just quickly enough so that the player can catch up to them. All throughout Elden Ring, From Software has shown that they want to increase the speed and complexity of their enemies, but are held back by their own limitations. Good examples include Margit/Morgoth, the Leonine Misbegotten, the Heroes of Zamor, the Beast Clergyman, Melania, Mesmer, Rellana, and Radahn II, who have attacks that are designed to roll catch, the most notable of which is the infamous series of quick slashes or thrusts. In some cases, this is slowed down to accommodate the player's limitations and the enemy's movements end up looking unnatural. In others, there is no way to avoid all of them besides spacing, which limits the player's options in combat. Speaking of player options, this is a good time to transition into part 2 of the video. Since I have gone through my overall thoughts on Elden Ring, let's move on to some of the intricacies that I found to be frustrating design flaws. Welcome to part 2 of this video. If you have enjoyed this video so far, do watch it till the end. If you are expecting me to tell you to like the video and subscribe to my channel, you are sorely mistaken. That is your choice alone and I have no say in the matter. Anyway, I will start with the player's abilities and then move on to enemy behavior and movesets. First off, the camera is bad. What a surprise. Over the years, From Software has shown that they want to focus more on fast-paced action, especially in their boss fights. In action games, the camera is usually zoomed out to allow the player to effectively deal with enemies around them. The camera is also usually higher up so that enemies in front are not blocked by the player's character model. In Souls games, however, the camera tends to be quite close to the character, which hinders the player when fighting multiple opponents. The pivot point of the camera also tends to be close to the character's head, which necessitates the enlargement of enemy models in order to facilitate gameplay clarity. I'll elaborate more on this later. For now, I'm going to continue shitting on the way the camera is implemented. When playing Elden Ring, players may notice that they may have to fight the camera every now and then. This is because the camera turns to follow the player whenever they move laterally. If the player continues to move without touching the camera, they will travel in a circle. When locked on, the direction is reversed. I think the best way to describe this is using the number 8 with a much larger bottom circle. The target would be in the middle of the top circle and the player's sideways movement can take the shape of either circle depending on whether they are locked onto the target. I take no issue with the top circle, but the bottom one is annoying to deal with, especially if the player is fighting a large boss. I generally dislike when games hijack the camera without my consent, especially in difficult games like these. I recently noticed that this is a far larger issue in Dark Souls 3 when doing another challenge run. Elden Ring improves upon this by allowing players to turn it off, which I'd recommend doing before starting the game. Mouse and keyboard users like myself have an advantage when fighting enemies without locking on, as dodging and camera control are not tied to the same appendage, that is the right thumb, as it would be for controllers. That means I can constantly adjust my camera with my mouse without sacrificing my ability to dodge at any given moment. When trying to lock onto a target, players may sometimes experience a camera reset when the game decides that there are no applicable targets. This is when the camera snaps to face the front of the player character. Whenever the game decides to reset the camera when the player means to lock onto a target, there is always a chance that the player would get killed through no fault of their own. For some odd reason, this is still bound to the same button as locking on, which means that there is no way to disable camera resets, or to have the two functions bound to separate keys. This probably also applies to controllers, which suffer yet again due to controllers having much fewer buttons than keyboards. This cannot really be helped since it is not really the fault of the developers. However, the decision to keep camera resets as a function is their fault. The number of scenarios where one would choose to reset their camera with a button press instead of simply moving it manually with a mouse or thumbstick are next to none. Which means that the function itself is unnecessary and should have been left out of the game entirely. Whenever the player has their back to a wall, their character model blocks their vision, which often leads to death, especially when fighting larger opponents, as the camera tends to look up at them, causing a larger portion of the screen to be obscured by the model. Although it can be argued that the player is at fault because of poor positioning on their part, it can also be said that From Software is at fault. Of course, one cannot expect the camera to clip through walls, but in my opinion the player model could have been made transparent if it is too close to the camera. I don't know why they chose to do nothing about it, especially since they have over a decade of experience making many similar versions of this game. Having to grapple with the camera is something that most players must tolerate when playing these games, and although I'm disappointed that From Software has not solved the issue, I have to recognize that there was some effort made to improve it. Still, the camera is not something that should be noticed by players in any game, let alone be part of the difficulty. That job belongs to the enemies and the environment, and the camera should never hinder the player's ability to tackle those challenges. Whenever the player sprints and turns in the opposite direction, the character is forced to perform a 180-degree turn animation which stops all movement and leaves them wide open until the animation is complete. This has led to more than a few deaths for me, and I would assume for many players as well, and even though it is technically the player's fault, it comes off as cheap and annoying. There is one way to prevent this from happening, and that is to perform a U-turn while sprinting. Still, its only purpose is to hinder the player, which means it deserves some criticism. One of the most used buttons in Elden Ring is the dodge button, and for good reason. As the game drags on, the player is punished more for blocking attacks, so shields become less viable in the late game. This funnels players towards dodging as their go-to option for avoiding damage, which I would have little problem with, were it not for one issue. Since the dodge and sprint functions are tied to the same button with no way to separate them, the developers were probably forced to have the action activate when the player releases the button. When the player holds the button down, the game causes the character to start sprinting, and when the player releases the button before the character starts sprinting, they will instead perform a dodge. In other words, whenever the button is pressed, the game waits for it to be released to determine the character's next action. This allows the player to delay their dodge slightly by holding down the button for only a split second, which can mean the difference between life and death. However, this benefit also comes packaged with a big issue. When playing Elden Ring or any Souls game, most players end up making a very common observation. The character may not perform a dodge even though they press the button on time. This is because whenever the player presses any button, some time always passes before it is released. This delay cannot be avoided, and in this case, players are often punished even when they correctly input a dodge just as an attack lands. Of course, I can see a counterpoint here, just input a dodge slightly earlier. It is a reasonable workaround, but that doesn't mean the problem does not exist. Again, many players have died multiple times because of this seemingly small issue. In comparison, blocking activates as soon as the button is pressed, allowing for instant reaction even though it is not a very good choice in the late game. After obtaining the DLC's Deflecting Heart tier though, I decided to incorporate it into my playstyle and was pleasantly surprised by how powerful it was. I found deflects to be much more reliable because there is simply no delay, so the player is not punished for reacting just on time. Besides, the timing is almost the same, so deflecting still takes skill to pull off reliably. If there is something that could have been done, it was probably to have the dodge and sprint functions mapped to separate buttons, or at least have it be an option. This would likely cause problems for controllers due to the limited number of buttons available, but I think it should have at least been attempted. Then again, this had been an issue for who knows how long, so I don't think they'll improve it anytime soon. Somewhere earlier in the video, I stated that the ability to jump was long overdue. After Demon's Souls, 3 Dark Souls games, and Bloodborne, From Software finally realized that people like to jump over things in video games. Ever since, I think somewhere around the early 2000s, it has become an expectation that direct control over a character should include the ability to jump, along with lateral movement in 2D environments and omnidirectional movement in 3D environments. There are exceptions of course, such as cover shooters or games that use a top-down perspective. The most obvious way that Souls games can benefit from this feature is in level design. Due to the player's ability to jump, the level designers are finally given more freedom to exercise their skills. This clearly paid off, as evident from the excellent layout of most of the legacy dungeons in Elden Ring. The gameplay designers also found at least 2 uses for this ability. 1. By allowing players to input a light or heavy attack after jumping, players are given more options in melee combat. 2. By turning off the bottom half of the character's hitbox when the player jumps, they have allowed players to jump over a new set of attacks that hit low to the ground, such as sweep attacks or shockwaves. As a result, whenever such attacks are performed, the player is given an opportunity to immediately counterattack if they so choose. As an enjoyer of fast-paced action games, I wholeheartedly support and praise this decision. However, for whatever reason, it took them a decade to provide players with the ability to jump, which is disappointing because the previous games could also have benefited from it. Fortunately, the jump and dodge buttons on controllers are different now, or so I've heard. This means that there should be no more occurrences of player characters doing a running jump when the player's intention is to stop sprinting and follow up with an immediate dodge. Bloodborne, for example, has a bad habit of killing players in this way. Regarding horse mechanics, I'm torn between tolerating them and outright hating them. Although the horse does save time when traveling in the open world, there is little use for it anywhere else. When pressing the dodge button, it does a dash with a unique particle effect attached and then continues to sprint. Since this dash already consumes stamina on top of looking like a dodge, it would make sense to give it some iframes. For some reason, the designers decided not to do this, so its only function is to transition the horse into a sprinting state, making the dash itself unnecessary. The lack of iframes also turns horseback combat into nothing more than a hit-and-run affair. The player is also forced to attack in two directions, with no way to change the direction of their attacks to deal with mobile enemies, not even when locked on. The Witcher 3 has a better implementation of horse combat because of 3 reasons. 1. The horse is invincible. 2. The player can hold their attack for as long as they want, and 3. When locked on, the direction of the player's attack changes depending on whether a locked on enemy is on the left or right side. Elden Ring's horse is not invincible, so it would be reasonable to expect that the player would be given the option to upgrade its health or increase its elemental resistances, or have its stats scale with the player's level. But this is not the case for some reason. This makes horse combat in the late game even less viable than in the early game. And since it is not invincible, whenever it dies and the player wishes to ride it again, the game opens a menu which asks the player if they wish to revive the horse with a healing flask. Of course, the answer is yes, which makes this menu nothing more than a hindrance which can get players killed in combat. For players who do not use the horse for combat, it can still be a hindrance during exploration, as it has another big issue related to movement. For some reason, whenever the horse is not facing directly forwards or backwards, inputting the forward or backward movement causes the horse to first move in the direction it is facing, before turning to move in the direction that the player inputs. The horse's turning circle can get players killed because it is quite large, especially when sprinting. For example, if they approach the side of a cliff and look down, then decide to move away from it, the horse may happily run off the cliff. This is not the player's fault, and so any related deaths are cheap. Thankfully, this can be offset by jumping straight up and then double jumping backwards, but that does not excuse the clunky mechanics of horse movement. Speaking of which, the ability to double jump was a good addition as it allows for more freedom of traversal. It also provides more room for error in platforming sections that connect parts of the map of differing verticality. Since From Software for some reason likes to add platforming sections to their action games, which almost exclusively involves dropping from a higher platform to a lower one, it would be common sense to assume that they would at least learn some lessons from platformers. Precision platforming works in those games because players are allowed to change their trajectory in mid-air to control their descent. The player character in Elden Ring does have a minuscule amount of mid-air control, but it is essentially negligible. The lack of any air strafing or trajectory correction makes platforming sections on foot just as horrible as the ones in previous games. Still, the lack of these features means that the level designers are limited by the player's jump distance when designing platforming sections, which end up being quite similar in terms of level geometry. When it comes to horse platforming though, the player can change its trajectory in mid-air, most notably when double jumping and for about a second after that. This is a marked improvement over the mid-air control that player characters get, so I have to give it some credit. However, there is another small issue related to inclines. From Software likes to tie their level geometry directly to the model, which results in problems when it comes to uneven surfaces. It would be reasonable to expect that if a player can walk up an incline, any incline that the player can walk on would be clearly distinguished from those that are too steep. For example, if the player can walk up any incline that is below 45 degrees, a level designer will only have inclines that are, let's say, shallower than 30 degrees or steeper than 60 degrees, so that there would be no confusion. From Software has shown that they can improve in this aspect, as even though the Dark Souls games have moments where this is not communicated well, namely the Crystal Cave and the tree roots in Ariandel, Elden Ring does not have many of these sections. Apart from the roots in the deep root depths, as well as those near the arena housing the Shade of Godfrey, most of the geometry in the game communicates this well enough to mitigate this issue entirely. Of course, I cannot talk about Elden Ring's movements mechanics without mentioning gravity and fall damage. From Software's games have always had a strange relationship with gravity, namely with how it looks. Whenever the player tries to walk on a steep surface, the character slides off extremely quickly with basically no acceleration. Dark Souls 1 has the most notable areas where this event can take place, namely Blighttown and the Crystal Cave. For Elden Ring, I am inclined to believe that this is likely no longer an issue, as I cannot remember if it ever happened to me. However, I have an issue with something else: how the player character looks when they jump. When it comes to the vertical trajectory, Elden Ring does it in a way that looks straight up uncanny. For some reason, gravity pulls them straight down right after reaching the apex of the jump, even if they jump while sprinting. Since the character's collision and hitbox are tied to the model, this may slightly affect gameplay in specific scenarios, but even then it may be negligible. As for fall damage, I do not like how it was implemented. The way it is implemented does not properly communicate to players how dangerous a fall can be, which can, has, and will continue to lead to many cheap deaths. Thankfully, I don't have to elaborate further because Illusory Wall, a far greater content creator in this genre than I can ever hope to be, has already made a video specifically talking about it. The fact that fall damage does not take momentum into account is baffling, especially when the player is on horseback. Double jumping just before touching the ground to cancel fall damage is something that is so ingrained into gamers' minds that it becomes second nature, like how crouching in stealth games somehow makes it more difficult for enemies to detect the player, or how large damage numbers mean that the player is doing well. So, to have both the player and horse die to fall damage just after the player double jumps specifically to prevent that seems very cheap, especially for those who don't know how fall damage works in this game. In my opinion, From Software's implementation of fall damage in Elden Ring specifically is only rivaled by their implementation of NPC questlines. In short, it fucking sucks. Ah yes, finally, enemy design. Most of these are complaints and can be applied to both regular enemies and bosses, but I'll focus more on the bosses as these flaws are more noticeable there. As someone who likes challenge runs, I've noticed that as more limitations are imposed, more design flaws become noticeable. As a result, I always prefer honest bosses over cheap ones in these games. It is of my opinion that this honesty in design usually correlates to the movesets of the subjects in question, on top of playable space, stage hazards, health and damage values, etc. Since I had prior knowledge of Elden Ring's faults in this area, I often found myself looking for them, especially towards the end of the game. Some bosses like Godfrey and Radahn surprised me with their relatively honest movesets, and so did Mithra in the DLC. However, these were rare exceptions as many other bosses were plagued with issues. Each move in the game can be placed into a spectrum of fairness, with one end being completely honest and the other end being extremely cheap. Attacks that are well telegraphed and consistently avoidable tend to be the most honest, while the ones that break these rules tend to be cheap. I will go through each trait that contributes to the lack of honesty that plagues the movesets of many of Elden Ring's bosses and enemies. It would not be inaccurate to call the Souls games turn-based action games, as in most cases, players and enemies would take turns attacking each other, at least when it comes to melee combat. Even though modern Souls games tend to be much faster than the older ones, this turn-based style is usually present. As a result, it would be reasonable to expect that players and enemies still get a roughly equal number of turns. Of course, this can fluctuate based on the player's weapon choice and enemy speed. In Elden Ring, the number of turns given to bosses increases yet again, but this time the player's turns are not increased as much as they should have been. In other words, the player is not sped up even though many enemies are. Most bosses in Elden Ring have long strings of attacks or combos that force players to wait longer periods of time in between their turns. This often leads to sentiments or questions such as when is it my turn or are you done? Although the presence of long combos is not something I would criticize, the overuse of such a trait certainly is. The high frequency of combos often leads to players just watching bosses perform their moves instead of engaging in a back and forth exchange, and contributes to some fights looking very boring as a result. Recently, I found myself enjoying boss vs boss videos on YouTube because it is entertaining to watch these bosses throw out moves against each other, and I think a part of that involves me not having to deal with these attacks in the moment. I've gone through this one earlier, but the ability for bosses to throw out multiple attacks that are specifically timed to catch players at the end of a dodge makes them somewhat cheap to fight against, especially in Elden Ring where dodging is often the best way to avoid taking damage. The presence of roll-catching combos specifically punishes players for dodging the initial attack at the right time, which can be very frustrating depending on how often an enemy does such a combo. One of the most controversial topics in Elden Ring is the presence and overuse of delayed attacks, and for good reason. Usually, players either dodge on reaction with the expectation that the incoming attack can be avoided by dodging just before the attack connects, or on memory with the knowledge that the incoming attack cannot be reacted to naturally and must be avoided through strict memorization. Now, I must make a distinction between slow attacks and delayed attacks. They are different and should not be confused. Slow attacks are intended to punish players who dodge too early and reward those who dodge on reaction and memory. Delayed attacks are intended to punish players who dodge on reaction and reward only those who dodge based on memory. The key difference is in the animation of the attack. When it comes to slow attacks, the wind-up and release is animated smoothly so that players can still see the attack coming and dodge accordingly. When it comes to delayed attacks, the wind-up can be animated smoothly, but there is always an unnatural pause followed by an instant release. This prevents players from reacting naturally and forces them to memorize the timing of these attacks. In some cases, the animation is intentionally slowed down just to catch players off guard when they first see it, resulting in extremely unnatural and nonsensical movements from the bosses, which in turn results in players immediately having their immersion broken. A boss that has too many delayed attacks forces players to defeat it through trial and error. Overuse of delayed attacks usually turns a boss fight into subconscious homework, which reduces player engagement, and Elden Ring has too many of these bosses. The worst cases include Margit, Godric, Commanders O'Neill and Nile, Elemer of the Briar, the Putrescent Knight, and of course Hoarah. Of course, many bosses in past games also use delayed attacks, such as the Demon Prince, Sister Frida, and Lady Maria. With the exception of the Nameless King, delayed attacks usually make up a minor part of these movesets, which allows players to rely on their reflexes for most of the fight. When it comes to instance unreactable attacks, that is, attacks that cannot be reasonably reacted to by most of the player base, they are generally cheap and should only be tolerated if they're in the middle of a combo because they can be memorized. Pontiff Salivan is a good example of this. Fortunately, Elden Ring also follows this rule. Most of the time. To my knowledge, the following moves break this rule: Godric's Stormcaller move, Radahn's Double Sword Slam, the Tree Sentinel's unbelievable Sideways Horse Bash, and to a lesser extent, Malenia's Uppercut Slash. As stated previously, there is an expectation that players with enough experience can avoid all damage, and while it is technically possible to complete Elden Ring without taking damage, it is a lot more difficult due to moves like these. The problem is that these bosses can use them from neutral, which leads to hesitation as players can suddenly get hit while trying to punish the boss. The usage of instant attacks encourages passivity and should not be present at all. At least they are very rare, and most bosses are not affected by them. Earlier, I stated that the Souls games can be seen as turn-based action games and that the bosses in Elden Ring have more turns than before. However, the players' turns are not lengthened as much as they should have been. When talking about long combos, I mentioned that they force players to wait longer periods of time in between their turns, so it would be natural to assume that the reward for surviving an entire combo would be a lengthy punish window for the player. But this is Elden Ring, so the question of when is it my turn makes another appearance. The problem here is the lack of ample recovery frames for the boss or enemy in question. The animation that plays at the end of a combo to return the boss to a neutral position is often too short, and thus the player is not given enough time to punish the boss before it performs another action. This leads to exchanges where the player gets one move per turn while the boss gets 4 or 5 in some cases, and this gets worse for players who employ slower weapons or spells. In some cases, they may not even get one hit off without trading with the boss. This even affected me, which I did not expect as I specifically chose quick weapons because I knew of this flaw before playing the game. The best examples are Morgott, both phases of Malekith, Malenia, Rallana, and surprisingly, Bale. The Souls games have conditioned players to expect that the recovery period that follows most attacks are opportunities to punish the boss. While Elden Ring bosses do provide more opportunities during the wind-up of their delayed attacks, they also reduce opportunities during the recovery frames of their attacks. Some bosses have moves that end in a big slam of sorts, which is an obvious indicator of recovery frames. This is how From Software has always animated their enemies. However, some bosses have what I call the Margit knife syndrome, where they will immediately follow up with an instant attack if the player gets too close. To be fair, this is avoidable as the moves activate based on the player's position, but this is no excuse for poor communication. This not only punishes players for taking their turn, but also results in unclear punish windows as the boss may or may not use the follow-up move, which results in more hesitation. Of course, I must address another one of Elden Ring's most notorious mechanics, known colloquially as input reading. Technically, it is false as many enemies and bosses actually react to the player's actions, but for the sake of simplicity I will call it input reading as it may as well be the same thing in practice. The most notable case of input reading involves one specific animation, the healing flask. I think that this alone is a great idea that was implemented poorly because the enemy reacts to the healing animation on frame 1, before the flask even appears in the character's hand. Instantly punishing the player's healing is cheap and invalidates the message that From Software's previous games have told us for years, that distance provides a good window for healing. Now, besides during the recovery frames of an enemy's attack, there is no guaranteed healing window because the player can be instantly punished through no fault of their own. It is worth noting that some bosses also punish attacks at close range, such as Melania cancelling her stagger animation into a parry. Other bosses also tend to punish ranged spells, such as the Tree Sentinel. A more egregious example would be Radagon. This mechanic straight up removes some ranged options and discourages aggression in melee combat. In its defense though, I think that it was a good idea that was poorly implemented. The idea behind this mechanic was to have enemies and bosses appear smarter than they actually are, as they react to the player's actions just like how the player reacts to theirs. However, it would be better to have this instead. 1. The enemy would react slower to healing flasks, perhaps about a second later, so that they would have to see the flask before attacking the player. This also prevents the player from taking guaranteed damage at the end of their healing animation. 2. Enemies would detect and dodge projectiles as they do now, but follow up with a gap closer that the player can punish. 3. All counterattacks performed by the enemy must be avoidable and players must be rewarded with a punish window. This would be a far better alternative as enemies would still be able to react to players but in a fair way, as players would still be able to take their turn, so to speak. As it is now, the input reading only serves to frustrate players. Notable examples include Margit/Morgoth, Crucible Knights, Heroes of the Moor, Elamur of the Briar, Godskin Apostles and Nobles, Draconic Tree Sentinels, Melania, Radagon, and Rellana. Regarding hitboxes, it is always a good idea to scale them as accurate to the models as possible. The developer in charge of hitboxes in Elden Ring did a great job, most of the time. In my experience, there were very few times where hitboxes were an issue big enough to warrant a complaint, at least from enemies and bosses that could fit on the screen. For giant enemies, hitboxes tend to be very large, especially for shockwave attacks that players are supposed to jump over. However, an issue arises as some of them tend to linger for too long. There are also some that were made way larger than the models suggest, allowing attacks that look like they should miss, land and deal damage to the player instead. Good examples of this include Commander Gaius, the Golden Hippo, Pre-Nerf Radahn, and Pre-Nerf Radahn. In these cases, the developers seem to have shown their sadistic side yet again as they intentionally enlarged these hitboxes to make the enemies in question more difficult in an artificial manner. After all, they did push the envelope in what they thought players could endure and make that the foundations of the boss encounters. This partially manifested in inaccurate and unfair hitboxes, ones that I am glad I did not have to deal with as my playthrough occurred after these nerfs took effect. With the rightful correction of Radahn's hitboxes in both instances, From Software has shown that this issue can be fixed. Unfortunately, they saw fit to release the game and its DLC with this issue present, and to make it worse, it was built into the game intentionally. Considering how previous games, especially Dark Souls 2, tend to get many complaints about hitboxes, one would think that From Software had left this issue behind entirely when creating Elden Ring, but this seems to be an incorrect assumption. Earlier, I mentioned an expectation that players with enough experience and practice can avoid taking any damage for an entire playthrough. With this in mind, it is only natural that unavoidable damage is something that most Souls players would never want in these games. So of course, From Software, the sadistic bunch that they are, went ahead and made it a reality in Elden Ring. Perhaps the most notable version of this is Mohg's Blood Boon ritual that he always uses to begin his second phase. Not only does it deal 3 instances of damage and activates bleed, it ignores iframes, so players are unable to avoid taking damage from this attack. The only instance of an attack ignoring iframes that I can remember from previous games is the Soul of Cinder's 5-hit combo in its second phase, and even then it dealt low damage per hit, did not stun players who dodged through the attack, and can be easily avoided by being far away. Mohg's Blood Boon ritual does not do this. The damage it deals is quite high, it stuns the player on hit and covers the entire arena. To make it worse, it also heals Mohg for about a quarter of his health. Yes, I'm definitely snickering with you, Miyazaki, you sadistic bastard. Anyway, the only way that players can avoid this move is to use the Purifying Crystal tier, which can only be obtained through Yura's questline. It removes the stun on hit and ignores most of the damage dealt by this move, but it takes up one of the 2 precious slots that make up the Wondrous Flask. It is an item that is too obscure for its own good, obtained in an area or NPC that has little to no relation to the enemy in question, comes with a major drawback when equipped, and its only use is to counter one annoying aspect of an enemy which would be extremely frustrating to fight without it. And of course, they did it again with the Sentry Torch. Let's move on. Earlier, I lauded the addition of jump attacks and shockwave attacks as they made Elden Ring's combat more varied and dynamic. However, it can be easy to get carried away amidst the excitement and ambition and implement these attacks in an undesirable way. Some bosses have too many shockwave or area of effect attacks that make them quite annoying to fight. One of the best examples is the magma worms and deathrite birds, which unleash too many explosions and AoE hitboxes that heavily limit the player's options when it comes to reacting and attacking. Another annoying aspect of many of Elden Ring's late game and DLC bosses is their overuse of after effects. It seems that nowadays every overhead slam must come with an explosion, every phase transition must involve a big nuke, and every combo must end with a shockwave or AoE that forces the player to avoid more attacks than they should. This further contributes to the overloaded movesets that these bosses have, and makes them even more annoying to deal with. When I said at the beginning of this video that Elden Ring's developers did not know when enough was enough, I was not kidding. The overuse of particle effects is another such instance. When fighting any enemy in any game, the player must be able to see the moves that they have to deal with. This is only fair. So of course, the sadistic bunch at From Software decided to throw in lots of particle effects for most of the moves that their bosses perform, and nowhere is it clearer than in Elden Ring's DLC. The base game also has bosses that suffer from this, one of the most notable being Malenia's wings obscuring her figure in her second phase. However, more criticism here should be levied against the DLC bosses, or at least part of them, such as the Divine Beast's Dancing Lion's lightning phase, Mesmer's ranged fire attacks, Bale's entire second phase, and of course Radahn's second phase. This is unforgivable to me because these already tough bosses have their difficulty artificially inflated because of their frequent lack of clarity, which contributes to these particular boss fights lacking honesty. When it comes to boss design in Souls games, there are many ways to make bosses enjoyable. 3 of these methods, when implemented poorly, tend to make these encounters quite annoying. The first is to artificially lengthen the fight, and there are 2 annoying ways to do this. The first is by having the boss frequently create distance, which not only compounds the issue of inadequate punish windows, but also forces the player to spend a considerable amount of time running towards the boss instead of actually fighting them. A couple of good examples are the Beast Clergyman and the DLC's Putrescent Knight, which spend a lot of time running away from the player after many of their attacks. The second way is to have the boss heal itself, which on the surface only serves to undo the player's progress. The longer a fight goes on, the higher the chance of the player making mistakes, so this move only increases the margin of error provided to the player. From Software had implemented healing in engaging ways before, either by allowing the player to interrupt the move by attacking Sister Frida, or by having the Soul of Cinder's healing take the form of health regeneration, which encourages the player to be more aggressive to out-damage said healing. In Elden Ring, however, 3 or rather 2 bosses come to mind that do these poorly. The ancestor spirits frequently teleport away and heal almost whenever they want, which is terrible especially since the player has no access to the horse in their very large arenas. While Mohg's Blood Boon ritual heals him for an absurd percentage of his already large health pool on top of all the other issues I've stated earlier. As far as I'm aware, there is no way to interrupt either. In other words, these bosses can artificially lengthen their encounters while the player can only watch it happen and deal with it. The only workaround that I could figure out, which only applies to Mohg, was to simply try to negate his cheap healing using bleed, which I normally avoid due to its sheer power. Still, I decided to do it because the alternative was to spend even more time chipping away at his health, which, as stated earlier, would result in me making many more mistakes during the fight, and by that point I was already tired of the game despite Mohg being a rather enjoyable boss. By now, you should already know my stance. Bosses that frequently create distance and/or heal themselves are somewhat cheap unless the player can prevent it or counter it. Unfortunately, Elden Ring failed in this regard, and we end up with these bosses. Fortunately, there is one boss that does healing in a semi-acceptable manner, and that is Malenia. She heals for a moderate amount if she lands a hit, regardless of whether the move does any damage. Because the game only checks if the hitboxes interact, not on whether any damage was dealt, the healing becomes cheap. It should be common sense that lifesteal only works if damage is dealt, but whoever was in charge of designing this boss fight decided that abiding by the rules of simple common sense just wasn't worth the time. Well, at least Malenia isn't smart enough to figure out that smacking the wall or floor of her arena can heal her too. Were it not for all her other issues, namely her inconsistencies with stance damage, hyper armor, and the AI cancelling her stagger animation, etc., I would have concluded that her lifesteal was honest. But because all these mechanics were piled onto Malenia by some sadistic designer, I have to criticize it. The other cheap way to guarantee that these encounters are more annoying is to include additional enemies in the fight at the beginning or have the boss summon other entities during the fight. Multi-boss fights are more difficult to get right than solo bosses, and Elden Ring has more than a few terrible examples, as you should know by now. Dealing with a boss on its own is challenging in most cases, and most players tend to focus entirely on the boss in front of them, so adding more enemies on top of that only makes things worse, especially if they are annoying to deal with themselves, like imps or dogs, or if they are straight up bosses like the misbegotten warriors that were put into various duel fights. This is why I do not shame anyone who uses spirit summons on gank bosses such as the Godskin Duo or Valiant Gargoyles. Anyway, a less annoying version of this is to have a solo boss summon entities during a fight, such as Renala with her temporary summons that can take the form of a giant, a bloodhound knight, or a pack of wolves. I think this is the only time where I can tolerate this mechanic, because although it forces the player to play defensively, it quickly reverts to a one-on-one when the summons disappear. Dealing with multiple opponents is not easy, especially for players new to this genre, and especially if one or more of these enemies take the form of bosses. Unfortunately, Elden Ring is full of these annoying fights and players have no choice but to deal with it. In Elden Ring, there are many bosses that use status effects to provide more gameplay variety, or to excuse the copy-pasting of several enemy and boss types. Some bosses, however, tend to overuse these status effects, and it seems that most of their moves rely on them to defeat the player. The good news is that there are only a couple of bosses where it becomes a notable issue. The bad news is that these bosses are made a lot more annoying because of them. Maliketh, despite having a lot of issues himself, also utilizes Destined Death, which deals more damage over time on top of his regular attacks, while the Scadutree avatar deals bleed damage with most of his ranged and AoE attacks. Speaking of AoE attacks, there is another issue I would like to call the floor is lava. The bosses in question, namely the Valiant Gargoyles, the Deathrite Birds, and yes, Mohg again, frequently use moves that limit the playable space by making certain areas too dangerous to traverse. The intention behind these moves is to get players to keep their environment in mind when traversing the arena, which I support. However, this can be quite difficult when the player is constantly looking up at enemies that are larger than them, which applies to most bosses in the game. When the camera is angled upwards, it is positioned lower, which means it is more difficult to keep track of how far something is on the ground, especially if the object takes the form of particles like mist or ice or fire. And in these fights, the player can accidentally wander into these zones and take damage. This tends to happen in Mohg's fight in particular because, for whatever reason, he tends to spam his blood flame attacks, which last for quite a while and can go behind the player. If the camera was zoomed out and moved upwards, this wouldn't be an issue, but of course it is because the camera sucks. Earlier, I stated that the field of view and pivot point of the camera necessitates the enlargement of enemy models. This often contradicts the lore, especially for human-type enemies. For example, many knight-type enemies such as Baldur Knights and Lothric Knights should be about the same size as the player, but the camera placement forces them to be larger. For bosses, From Software tends to make them very large for artistic reasons, most notably to emphasize their power level, sometimes to a comical degree. A good example would be Godfrey, who has a tarnish like the player but is about 3 times their height. Of course, with size comes a larger collision box which can push players around as the boss moves around, like Smo and Kalameet from Dark Souls 1. Anyway, a far larger issue would be how the camera negatively affects the player when fighting giant enemies. From Software has shown that they can zoom out the camera when the player locks onto certain giant enemies, but the zoom effect is not nearly enough to help the player in such scenarios. So why not zoom the camera all the way out when locking onto all giant enemies? Well, sometimes From Software likes to sacrifice smooth and intuitive gameplay to satisfy some nebulous artistic vision, and this camera issue, which has been present for as long as the dinosaurs have roamed the earth, is one of them. As long as the player is intimidated by giant enemies that they must constantly look up at in order to fight, the developers will gladly ignore all camera issues, resulting in poor gameplay clarity. So the next time you fight a giant enemy in any of their games, remember that it is not your fault for failing to keep track of animations that you cannot even see because you're too busy hacking away at its angles. Finally, we move on to the silhouette problem. Elden Ring has enemies and bosses, especially the larger ones, that suffer from an unclear silhouette when fought at close range, such as Revenants and the DLC's Divine Beast Dancing Lion. The importance of silhouettes in animation in these games is to indicate movement, and a silhouette that does not clearly indicate movement negatively affects the enemy in question. This is why enemies that use spears, such as Lothric Knights with great shields, tend to be more annoying to deal with than their counterparts that employ other weapons. When coupled with camera issues, bosses with unclear silhouettes can be quite annoying to deal with, and nowhere is this issue clearer than the numerous ulcerated tree spirits found in the base game, and unfortunately the DLC as well. Alright, so that's about it for part 2 of this video. I tried to include as many of my observations that I could. All throughout the making of this video, that is the many weeks I spent sorting through hours upon hours of footage, writing and recording the script and piecing everything together, I was plagued with doubt that perhaps I had been too negative or too cruel in my assessments. I usually try to identify one big mistake with every video that I make and try to avoid it in the future. I thought that this video was going to be the same, but then I later realized that I was right to be this negative. After all, this is the 6th version of Demon's Souls, but many issues present here can be traced all the way back to Dark Souls 1 or even Demon's Souls, not to mention there are many issues unique to Elden Ring itself. So if this video was going to have its own big mistake, it probably wouldn't be that. Anyway, I originally wanted to follow up with a video ranking Elden Ring's bosses on these criteria, and another one raising my concerns on From Software's future. But it seems that I no longer care enough about Elden Ring to make the former. So here's an Excel sheet that I use to help me assess these flaws in boss design as well as my overall rankings based on these aspects. Of course, I could be wrong since I've only played the game once, but then again I don't care enough to make sure that I get all of them right. Now that I think about it, Elden Ring has a very disappointing track record when it comes to bosses, at least when it comes to gameplay. Most boss fights feature aggressive solo bosses, there are no unique duo fights, and creativity seems to be at an all-time low. As for the overall game, From Software seems to have taken all the wrong lessons from the base game and released a DLC with the same issues, which can only mean that they insisted that they were right. This is why criticism is important. Unfortunately, From Software does not seem to listen very often, let alone very well. But that is a topic for another video, one that I will feature on my other channel that I took most of this footage from. If you like challenge runs, namely within the Souls genre, you may want to hit there. Alright, this video is over. Thanks for watching.